We will start the brain stem. Now we have said at the first lecture introduction, we take midbrain, pons and medulla together and we call it brain stem. So if you read these broad functions of the brain stem, which is a very generalized, simplified form, because we don't expect you to know so much about the brain stem in detail. Whatever you need is needed for your management of patients. So the first point is that the brain stem is a conduit or an area for all ascending and descending nerve tracts to pass from the spinal cord to the cerebrum, and from the cerebrum down to the spinal cord and the cranial nerves. So this is the first point that you need to remember. So it's a passage or conduit for ascending and descending nerve tracts. So ascending means sensory and descending means motor. So you should be able to understand it. Then it contains reflex control centers, or you can just call them control centers of your respiratory functions and cardiovascular functions. So your respiratory and cardiovascular centers are in the brain stem. So if you damage brain stem for some reason, actually you can affect these respiratory and cardiovascular centers and you can die of it. Then the other important thing is, if the brain is dead, if this the cerebrum is dead, say due to accident or something, but the brain stem is not dead, then you can the patient can live as a vegetable if you maintain the other vital functions with assistance from at the ICU. So if you connect the person to a machine, person might be able to live because the vital centers are in the brain stem. So with some degree of support, they can live. Even if the upper part is gone, they cannot do any intellectual or they cannot do any other function, higher level functions, any voluntary functions, but all reflex essential functions can be maintained. You will learn details by the physiology department. Then the other point is that the brain stem is associated with control of consciousness or alertness. So there is an area called reticular formation in the brain stem. It's a long area. It's not limited to one area. So this reticular formation is a long collection of cells. So these cells are responsible. They get this reticular formation in the brain stem, get information from all these ascending tracts, and that area continuously send information to the higher centers and keeps the person conscious and alert. If you damage to certain areas of this reticular formation in the brain stem, again the patient can become unconscious. The alertness will be lost. Then the other important thing is, except the first two cranial nerves, the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve, first two cranial nerves, 1 and 2, all the other cranial nerves, from the third cranial nerve to the 12th cranial nerve, they arise from the brain stem. Some arise from the medulla, the midbrain, some arise from the pons, and some from the upper and lower medulla. So except the first two pairs, all other cranial nerves from 3rd to 12th pairs of cranial nerves, they arise from the brain stem. When I say they arise from the brain stem, you can understand that the cell bodies of all these neurons of cranial nerves that come out from the brain stem will be there in the brain stem. So we have discussed in the previous lectures that when there is a collection of cell bodies in the central nervous system, you call them nuclei. So you can call these cranial nerve nuclei. So from 3rd to 12th cranial nerve nuclei are found in the brain stem, in the midbrain, pons and medulla. So remember this point as well. So these are the main points that I want you to remember when it comes to the brain stem. So if you go to different parts of the brain stem now, if you just look at it, you will see that it's a very short area, midbrain. It's about 2 centimeters in length. It's a very short area compared to other parts of the brain. And you can say that it connects the pons and cerebellum, forebrain. But these are, you can just, make good. The moment you see it, that it's in the middle, you can say it connects the cerebrum to the cerebellum, pons, and all that. Okay, so it's a simple thing. Then the other details are on the posterior surface of the midbrain. This is the anterior surface. On the posterior surface, you get these two colliculi. superior and inferior colliculi. And the anterior end will give rise to what are called cerebral peduncles. You can call them crus cerebri, the plural, or cerebral peduncles. Then inside you get this canal passing through, derived from the cavity in the neural tube, which is called the cerebral aqueduct, which connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. Then the midbrain contains the cranial nerve, third and fourth cranial nerve, nuclei. Fourth is this one, oh, yeah. Third and fourth cranial nerve nuclei are in the midbrain. So if we look at the picture now, this is a cross section of the midbrain at the superior colliculus level. Now in this section, you can see, now this is the posterior side, this is the anterior side. This is the anterior side. So you can see, you can divide the midbrain into three main areas according to this picture. Most posterior end, where you get the superior and inferior colliculi. So this is the superior colliculus and this is the inferior colliculus. That area is called tectum. In the most anterior end are the cerebral peduncles. So this area, this whole area is the cerebral peduncle. So you have these two cerebral peduncles, and this middle area. Now this was tectum, and this was the cerebral peduncle, and the middle area is called tegmentum. So you have tectum with the superior and inferior colliculi, then cerebral peduncles, which actually carries all motor tracts down. The motor tracts from the cerebrum or the cerebral hemispheres down to the cranial nerve nuclei, and the spinal cord, they come down through the cerebral peduncles. Actually, you can later understand, you can actually divide it into three parts. You have the descending main motor tracts, starting from the precentral gyrus, motor cortex, coming here, and from frontal and parietal lobes, descending nerve tracts, motor tracts come through on either side of the. You will learn these details when you do the nerve tracts. The middle part here, the tegmentum part will contain all ascending nerve tracts. Again, you will learn these ascending nerve tracts. They are compressed and confined to these areas, some of these areas in the tegmentum. Then other than that, I'll move to the next slide. Other than that, as you can see in the labels, there is what is called the red nucleus. This is a collection of cell bodies again. That's why it's called a nucleus. So this is called red nucleus, which can only be seen at the level of the superior colliculus. I said this cross section is at the superior colliculus level. Therefore, you see the red nucleus here. Then this one is called substantia nigra. So you can very clearly see this gray colored, dark colored area. So this people used to call this a basal ganglion. Still, some people consider it a basal ganglion, but in my list of basal ganglia, I think I did not include it. But it has a lot of connections with other basal ganglia, but it's not in the cerebrum. You can understand that it's in the midbrain. Maybe because of that, people don't call it a basal ganglion anymore. But this substantia nigra, it's fairly long. It is also maybe 2 centimeters long, just like the midbrain. Therefore, in the total, the full extent of the midbrain, you can see the substantia nigra. Whether you cut at the superior colliculus level or inferior colliculus level, you see the substantia nigra. But the red nucleus can only be seen if you cut at the inferior colliculus level. Then you can also see the cerebral aqueduct here, and this is what is necessary for you to learn. And here, between the two cerebral peduncles, you call this area interpeduncular fossa. There's a gap between the two cerebral peduncles. So this is all about the midbrain in its transverse section. So similarly, you can cut through at this area, you can cut through the inferior colliculus level. Now, even though you don't see the collections of cell bodies here, at the superior colliculus level, you should be able to find the the nucleus of the third cranial nerve or the oculomotor nerve at the superior colliculus level. Then at the inferior colliculus level, behind that, you will be able, if you cut at the inferior colliculus level, you will be able to find the nucleus of the, this is the third nucleus, this is the fourth cranial nerve nucleus or the trochlear nerve nucleus. So that you can forget for the moment and you can revisit it later. Who is, sir, what is the function of substantia nigra? Now just leave it for the moment. It has connections with the lentiform nucleus. Now you remember the lentiform nucleus. You remember the corpus striatum, combination of lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus. So substantia nigra has a lot of chemical, neurochemical connections with this lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus. So you will learn these connections. It's a lot of functional aspects. You will learn it. You will learn it. Actually diseases of substantia nigra also can give rise to some conditions. You will learn all that. Okay. So just wait. So when you do the pharmacology again in the third year, again you will learn about connections between the substantia nigra and the caudate and the lentiform nucleus. I think it has got something to do with Parkinsonism as well and other movement disorders, chorea and all that. Details I'm not very sure about, but just wait. Okay. Okay, pons. So the second part of the brainstem, pons. It is anterior to the cerebellum. Okay, so bridges the two cerebral hemispheres. Again, it's something that you can say by just looking at it. Okay, I will not read this. I will just show you and describe it. Now this is the pons area. Now this was the midbrain. You can see this is the superior colliculus and this is the inferior colliculus. Cerebral aqueduct it here. So this is the tectum is here, tegmentum is this area, and these are the cerebral peduncles on the anterior side. Interpeduncular fossa is this area. Okay, so this is the midbrain area, the two cerebral peduncles. This is the interpeduncular fossa. So then this is the midbrain part that I just tried to show you. Actually, you can see one of the cranial nerves coming out. This is the third cranial nerve. You will learn it later. So this is the third cranial nerve that is coming out from the ventral aspect of the midbrain. Actually, if you go into details, fourth cranial nerve comes out from the dorsal aspect of the midbrain and goes around the midbrain and comes to the anterior side and cross each other again. Okay, so it's a very peculiar nerve. You will learn details later. Okay, so then we started discussing the pons. So this is the area of the pons. This is the anterior side of the pons and this is the posterior side of the pons. Actually, you can't see the posterior side of the pons unless you remove the cerebellum here. So it's covering the posterior side or the roof area of the pons. And what you get in the roof area is the fourth ventricle. So the pons is completely in front of the fourth ventricle. Now the medulla, we said only the upper part of the medulla contributes to form the fourth ventricle, but the pons fully contributes to form the fourth ventricle at its back. Then this is an anterior view of the pons. This one is an anterior view. This is a sagittal section. You can understand that. In this anterior view, you see this groove for basilar artery. You should be able to read this. So you get an artery on this, which is a main artery that supplies the brain with blood. So this basilar artery lies in this basilar groove for the basilar artery. You will learn the blood supply of the brain, and during that you will see the details of the basilar artery. Then another important thing is, now you see here the pons moves laterally like this. Can you see? You get the cerebellum here. So actually this part of the pons is actually, it is the part that connects the pons to the cerebellum behind, and this large area is actually the middle cerebellar peduncle. Cerebellar peduncle. middle cerebellar peduncle, that is the part that connects the pons to the cerebellum. It's a very large cerebellar peduncle. There is a superior cerebellar peduncle and an inferior cerebellar peduncle, which are fairly small. So this is the middle cerebellar peduncle that connects the pons to the cerebellum. Then the other point about the pons is that you can see on the anterior side here, you can see a very large cranial nerve coming out here and a very small one here coming out. So these are actually the motor root. The small one is the motor root and the large one is the sensory root. So it's the motor root and the sensory root of the trigeminal nerve, fifth cranial nerve, or the trigeminal nerve. So they emerge from the anterior aspect of the pons. Their cell bodies, or the nuclei, the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve and the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve also therefore found inside the pons. So you have learned many things about the pons now. So further, if you further go into the structure of the pons, if we cut the pons in a cross section like that and look at it, a transverse section. So this is very close to that transverse section. It has some 3D appearance, but it's a transverse section. Look from anterior side. In this transverse section, actually, you can see the trigeminal nuclei that I was talking about, the sensory nucleus and the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The diagram has not drawn it very clearly. Otherwise, you should see this large sensory root, sensory nerve, and the small motor root. So one is large, as you can see here. Motor one is small, sensory one is fairly large. Then you can see the fourth ventricle at the back here. Fourth ventricle at the back. Now this area you can see here, it's the middle cerebellar peduncle. So it's a very large cerebellar peduncle. So if you draw the cerebellum, you should draw the cerebellum on that area. Okay. So this is the middle cerebellar peduncle area. Then again, this diagram has not drawn. You have a groove here, which is for the basilar artery. They have not drawn it. Now the idea, their idea is to show you something else. You can see many transverse fibers going like this from the pons to the cerebellar, middle cerebellar peduncles. So they are entering the cerebellum. So many fibers coming from the higher centers of the brain, from the frontal lobe, from the temporal lobe, they come to the level of the pons. Then there are nuclei here. Can you see? These are all collections of cell bodies. These are all collections of cell bodies here. And from these nuclei, new nerve fibers start and they run transversely, giving rise to these transverse pontine fibers. These are called pontine nuclei. The collections of cell bodies are called pontine nuclei. And these nerve fibers going into the middle cerebellar peduncle, through the middle cerebellar peduncle into the cerebellum, are called transverse pontine fibers. So in the pons anteriorly, you get the pontine nuclei, you can read it, and the transverse pontine fibers. Transverse pontine, they haven't labeled it as such, transverse pontine fibers. Okay. So these are the transverse pontine fibers. You can see them in the diagram when I delete these things. Okay. So you can identify these transverse pontine fibers like this. Okay. Then there's another point. The main motor pathway travel in the middle part of the middle cerebral peduncle, the middle part of the cerebral peduncles in the midbrain, in that area. I said this main motor tract starting from the motor cortex. So the precentral gyrus pass through that. That same motor tract has to pass through the pons also. So here it is. Main motor tracts pass in that area of the pons. You call that tract pyramidal tract. You call it pyramidal tract. It is the main motor tract going into the motor nerves of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves to move the skeletal muscles. Starting from the if this is the central sulcus, maybe somewhere here. This is the central sulcus. Then this tract starts from this area, primary motor cortex area, and come all the way down, go through the middle part of the cerebral peduncle, go through the pons, and later when you do the midbrain, you will see that they go through this, which are called pyramids. pyramids of the, you can call it pyramid of the medulla. That is in the medulla, okay, not in the pons. So this is how these nerve tracts come down, the motor tracts. I am not talking about the sensory tracts yet because this is not the time to talk about the sensory tracts. So then this passed through the pyramids. So that's why you call them pyramidal tracts. You can call it pyramidal tracts for two reasons. One thing is some of these fibers, many of these fibers in this pyramidal tract, they start from pyramidal cells in the motor cortex. You remember the pyramidal cells is one of the few types of cells found in the motor cortex. They start from the pyramidal cells and come down. For that reason, you can call them pyramidal tracts. And they pass through the pyramids of the medulla. For that reason also, you can call them pyramidal tracts, whatever it is. Okay, no one will ask you why you call them pyramidal tracts. So this is about the pons. And here, you can see, I told you about this reticular formation that keeps you awake. If you damage this area, you will get unconscious. So this is, you can see part of the reticular formation here. I don't know whether they have drawn it in the midbrain area. No, that diagram is not a diagram, that's a section. So in diagrams, in this brain stem, you can actually in different areas in the medulla, pons, and even in the lower part of the midbrain, you can draw reticular formation. Okay, these are collections of cells which get a lot of sensory inputs. Okay, so you might, certain things when I tell you will appear to you very vague. Okay, so can't help it because you haven't had physiology lectures yet, I suppose. So once they start and they start talking about this reticular formation, cardiac centers and all, you will be able to relate these structural details with the function. Then the third one, the medulla, the full name of medulla is medulla oblongata. So again, you have the same description, you can just look at the specimen and write down this description. Okay, so it connects the spinal cord at the level of the foramen magnum. So that is where the brain stem becomes the spinal cord, roughly foramen magnum, where the first spinal nerve roots start. Okay, so it's not a big deal. Then the anterior surface contains pyramids and olives. I'll show you. Then the posterior surface contains cuneate and gracile tubercles below and the lower part of the forearm. Okay, so this description I'll show you. Laterally are inferior cerebellar peduncles. Okay, so this is how it is. So just look at the diagram. Now this is midbrain. We are done with the midbrain. This is the pons. Again, we are done with the pons. We didn't do the cerebellum yet. We'll do it towards the end of this lecture. So this is the medulla. So we are discussing this part now, medulla. Now medulla, you can see here, as I said before, this is the midline. Very close to the midline on either side, you get these pyramids. So these will carry the descending tracts, descending motor tracts, main motor tracts, which are called the pyramidal tracts. So you call them either, you call them pyramids, therefore you call the tracts pyramidal tracts, or you have the pyramidal tracts in them so that you call it pyramids, whatever. We don't know it. Okay. So anyway, you call them pyramids. Then on either side of the pyramids, which is not very clear here, you get this olive. You get this olives on either. It's not very long. Okay. It's olives. So it's okay. 3D appearance, if you cut this in like this and look at it here, this is how you see it. You have the pyramids here, olives on either side, deep to it. Okay. Partly deep to it. Then further, laterally and behind, you get the inferior cerebellar peduncles, like this. Inferior cerebellar peduncles. Actually, you can see the inferior cerebellar peduncles here on either side. So the inferior cerebellar peduncles, we said the middle cerebellar peduncles connect the pons to the cerebellum. Inferior cerebellar peduncles connect the medulla to the cerebellum. Okay. Then you would wonder where the superior cerebellar peduncles are, which I didn't talk about when I talk about the midbrain. Now here in this posterior view or the dorsal view of the midbrain, again you can identify this is the midbrain area, brainstem of the midbrain, superior and inferior colliculi, and this is the trochlear nerve, the fourth cranial nerve coming out from the dorsal aspect. I told you it comes out from the dorsal aspect and winds around and crosses again like this, very peculiar nerve. Okay, so forget about it for the moment. So that is the midbrain, and this is the middle cerebellar peduncle that is connecting the cerebellum to the pons. This is the inferior cerebellar peduncle that is connecting the medulla to the cerebellum. Now remember, this is the posterior side, this is the anterior side. Okay, don't get confused between the two sides. Okay, so here you see another very small peduncle here connecting the, this is actually connecting the midbrain to the cerebellum. This is the superior cerebellar peduncle. Here you can read it, superior cerebellar peduncle. So in the end, superior cerebellar peduncle connects the midbrain to the cerebellum, that is this one. Middle cerebellar peduncle connects the pons to the cerebellum. Inferior cerebellar peduncle connects the medulla to the cerebellum. Okay, so that is it. Okay, then coming back to the medulla again. Now we have already said that the third and fourth cranial nerves emerge from the midbrain area. Fifth cranial nerve, its motor and sensory parts, emerge from the pons. Then all other cranial nerves, they either emerge between the pons and the cerebellum. Namely, you get the abducent nerve, sixth cranial nerve. Then you get the facial nerve, the seventh cranial nerve. So this one, and the vestibulocochlear nerve, the eighth cranial nerve. And there's a very small nerve which is called the nervus intermedius. So this one, this very small one here, is called nervus intermedius, part of the facial nerve. Okay, that also arises from the junction between the pons and the medulla. Junction between the pons and the medulla. The abducent, you can see here, this is a lot of details, okay, but better to know these details. Abducent arises between the pons here and the pyramid of the medulla. You can see here very clearly. And then the other three, the facial nerve, vestibulocochlear nerve, and the nervus intermedius part of the facial nerve, they arise from that area laterally, which is called cerebellopontine angle. And here it's the pons, medulla, and the cerebellum. Here you call it cerebellopontine angle. Okay, so then if you look at other cranial nerves, you can see between the pyramid and the olive. Here, pyramid and the olive, you get certain other cranial nerve. This is the hypoglossal nerve. So the hypoglossal nerve comes out between the pyramid and the olive. Okay. Then the vagus nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, and the cranial root of the accessory nerve, the three cranial nerves, they come out between the olive and the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which is not very clear here. They come out between the olive and the inferior. This diagram is not clear on that. Okay, so it's like this. Okay, I deleted this. So it's like this. You get the olive here. You get the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So your 12th cranial nerve comes out here. 12th one. Then your 9th, 10th, and 11th cranial nerves, they come out in this area between the inferior cerebellar peduncle and olive. Okay, so they can go down like this. Okay, need not be restricted to that area. Okay, then the other point is, now this is a posterior view. As I said before, you have the midbrain, then you have the this. If I divide it like this, so this is roughly above that. Roughly is the pons. So then the fourth ventricle is, I said, you know, the fourth ventricle is fully related to the posterior aspect of the pons. Now this area is the upper part of the medulla, and this area is the lower part of the medulla. Now here, if you overlap this, I'll show you later when I talk about the cross sections. I'll show you exact. You know, I have one brain stem. I have, you know, if I cut here, for instance, I don't have it now. If I cut here across, how will you cut in this diagram? Whether it's here or there. Okay, I don't know whether you understand it. So I'll show you that later. But for the moment, remember that this is the anterior view and this is the posterior view. In the anterior view, since you can't see the fourth ventricle, you can only say that this is the medulla, that area. Okay. Now in this one, since you see the fourth ventricle, you see a difference in the medulla itself. there is a medulla contributing to the fourth ventricle, and there is a part of the medulla not contributing to form the fourth ventricle. Now, if you go back to the development, you remember the part that is not contributing to form the fourth ventricle is the lower medulla. And the part that contributes to form the fourth ventricle is the upper medulla. Now, since this upper medulla, the roof, the back of the upper medulla is broken and opened up to form the fourth ventricle, upper medulla can also be called open medulla because it's open here. And the lower medulla, since it is not open to the fourth ventricle, you can call it closed medulla. So it's open and closed medulla. Okay, so upper medulla and lower medulla can be replaced by open medulla and closed medulla. Then on the posterior aspect in this diagram, you can see something else here. Now you don't see the pyramid olive because they are on the anterior side. You can see a raised area here and here, and again an area here and here, almost between the open medulla and the closed medulla. Okay, at the upper end of the closed medulla. Now this is called gracile nucleus. You call it not nucleus, gracile tubercle, because you don't see the nucleus outside. What you see outside is a raised area. You call it a tubercle. You know what is tubercle? Tubercle. Okay. So this is gracile tubercle and this is cuneate tubercle. Now underneath these tubercles, if this is gracile tubercle and if this is cuneate tubercle, underneath that you get a collection of nerve cell bodies, both. Collection of nerve cell bodies. These are collections of nerve cell bodies of some of the ascending sensory nerve tracts. Sensory nerve tracts. You will learn later during Dr. Himani Amaratunga's lecture which nerve tracts are involved with this cuneate and gracile and cuneate tubercles or nuclei. Okay, so I will not go into the details of that. It would be too much for you. Okay, so just remember these two terms. They are not unimportant. Okay, don't think that it's not necessary to manage patients. Okay, so to understand the nerve tracts, you need some sort of basic knowledge. So for this reason, now you learned a lot of things about the medulla by now. You know what passes through the medulla. Then I didn't mention. Now if you take a cross section here, so you will have your medulla like this. You get the pyramids, you get the olives on either side, then you get the inferior cerebellar peduncles, and on this side you get either the canal or the open fourth ventricle. So these are motor tracts here, pyramids. You get your sensory tracts, ascending tracts in that area. Okay, so you will learn this when I do the when Himani does the nerve tracts and when I do the cross sections of the brain stem. We'll come back to it later. I didn't go into that detail. Okay. Then you can see something else also here. Now we have done with the medulla also partly. And now what you see here in the fourth ventricle, now this is, I said the line is somewhere here. This is the pons. Okay. This area is called the flow of the fourth ventricle. Okay. Flow of fourth ventricle. Roof is formed by the cerebellum behind. Flow of the fourth ventricle. So in the area of the pons, in the flow of the fourth ventricle, you can see a raised area here, which is called facial colliculi. So this should come under the pons, okay, not under medulla. So this raised area is there because you get in the pons, you get the facial, even though the facial nerve and the abducen nerve arise between the pons and the medulla here, their nuclei are in the pons itself. So in the pons, you get, if this is the pons, you get one nucleus like this, the facial nucleus, and the abducen nucleus is like this, and the fibers pass from the abducen nucleus like this around the facial nerve, raising this area. This is the fourth ventricle area. This area, fourth ventricle area. So this raised area, which you can see here, are due to this arrangement of fibers around the facial nucleus and the arrangement of abducen fibers around it. You call it facial colliculus. You call it facial colliculus, like superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. So it's a rounded raised area in the floor of the fourth ventricle in the level of the pons. Inside the pons is the facial colliculus. Okay. Then there's another point. We know that if you take the cerebral hemispheres, like this, if this is right and if this is left, if this is the body of the person, and if this is right and if this is left, you know, when it comes to motor and sensory both, right side of the brain controls the left side of the person, and the left side of the brain controls right side of the person. So when I say left side controls right side, this is called contralateral representation. Ipsilateral means same side. Ipsilateral means same side. Contralateral means opposite side. As a contralateral representation of the body, I have passed contralateral representation. Now, therefore, this motor and sensory tracts has to cross to the opposite side. Both motor and sensory has to cross to the opposite side. Now, this crossing takes place in the medulla. If you take the closed medulla, this is closed medulla. In the upper part of the closed medulla, the sensory tracts cross. Not all sensory tracts. Okay, some of the sensory tracts cross at the upper part of the medulla. Some sensory tracts cross at below the medulla at the spinal cord level. That's a different issue. You will learn it later. Okay. Some sensory tracts cross at the upper part of the closed medulla. Some the motor tracts, not all, about 80% of the motor tracts also cross at the closed medulla, but at the lower part of the closed medulla. So this is upper part of the closed medulla. This is lower part of the closed medulla. So sensory and motor crossings are in the medulla. Sensory one in the upper part of the closed medulla, motor one in the lower part of the closed medulla. Actually, on the anterior aspect, you can see some of these tracts crossing outside. If you use a magnifying lens, you don't see the nerve fibers. You see collections of nerve fibers to a magnifying lens. Not in all specimens. Now, this is a cross section. You can see this is medulla. Now, this is the open medulla above, and this is the closed medulla here. You can see this B section is at the upper part of the closed medulla. A is at the lower part of the closed medulla. So this is A. So you see the motor decussation, motor crossing. Decussation is crossing. Term decussation, you can read it, means crossing. So motor decussation is at here. This is sensory decussation here. Sensory decussation is here at the upper level. You can see the fibers responsible for this sensory decussation, the sensory crossing, actually arises from this cuneate and gracile nuclei. Cuneate and gracile nuclei here, which I was referring to just a moment ago. Cuneate and gracile nuclei. So don't get confused. Okay, you have time to learn it. Just remember some of the points that you can remember here. About the cerebellum. Cerebellum lies posterior to the fourth ventricle. Pons and medulla. Posterior to the fourth ventricle, pons and medulla. The cerebellum has two hemispheres. Now the cerebrum had two cerebral hemispheres, left and right cerebral hemispheres. Just like that, cerebellum also has two cerebellar hemispheres joined by a central vermis. And this I have already done now. The cerebellum is connected to the brainstem through superior, middle and inferior cerebellar peduncles. Now you can go into the details. You know that the superior cerebellar peduncles connects it to the midbrain, middle cerebellar peduncle connects it to the pons, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle connects it to the medulla. Okay, so these terms, okay, I'll just read it. It has, the cerebellum has three lobes. I'll show you diagrams later. Okay, so the cerebellum has, when it comes to lobes, there are three lobes: anterior, middle, and loculonodular lobes. This will confuse you. Then fissures, there's a primary fissure, and there is a horizontal fissure, and a uvulonodular fissure. This is very complicated. Okay, so forget about the slides. I'll try to explain it here. Now the cerebellum, it is like, now just remember it like this. Now if this is the anterior end, this is the anterior end. and this is the posterior end. Okay, so here this one, this is the posterior end, this is the anterior end. Okay, this is superior surface, this is inferior surface of the cerebellum. Try to understand it. Okay, and this is the right cerebellar hemisphere, and this is the left cerebellar hemisphere, and this part is called vermis. Vermis, which connects the two cerebellar hemispheres. Now, one functional thing, we'll come back to it later. Okay, we'll do the structural things. Now, you have a vermis in the center connecting the two cerebellar hemispheres. So, is that clear? Okay. So, then, other point is, if you take this anterior end, now concentrate on the anterior end. If I start here from the anterior end, draw a line along this and go to the inferior surface, going like this and going to the inferior surface like this in this direction. Okay. So if I take, it's like a piece of paper. Now you have a piece of paper, say A4 paper like this. Okay. This is the anterior end. This is the posterior end. Okay. You turn this, you fold this paper like this. So it would be like this now. This is the anterior end. This is the posterior end of the paper. I'm referring to this paper. Okay. So this is also like this. So you have this on the, this is the superior surface. This is the inferior surface. Okay. So you have this cerebellum like this. Okay. Now having that in mind, we'll discuss the lobes. Having that in mind, we'll discuss the lobes. Now this is how you define the lobes of the cerebellum. Now this is the anterior lobe because it's on the anterior side. Okay. And you can see a primary fissure here. This fissure is called the primary fissure. Now the primary fissure actually divides the cerebellum into its anterior and middle lobes. There is no posterior lobe separately. Middle lobe is also the posterior lobe. So it's either anterior lobe and posterior lobe or anterior lobe and middle lobe. There is no third lobe when it comes to anterior posterior lobe. There's a third lobe in a different sense. So this is the anterior lobe separated from the middle lobe by the primary fissure. Then this whole area, now middle lobe starts here, you can call it posterior lobe, okay, starts here and it continues like this. That's why I said this paper, a folded paper. So it continues onto the inferior surface as well. It's the same middle or the posterior lobe starting from here, okay. Okay. Then you get this horizontal fissure. Can you see a horizontal fissure? This horizontal fissure actually separates the superior surface from the inferior surface. That's all the business of, structural business of horizontal fissure. Do not think that the horizontal fissure separates the anterior lobe from the posterior lobe, because here also it's the posterior lobe or the middle lobe. Anterior lobe is separated from the posterior middle lobe by the primary fissure. Horizontal fissure just separating the superior surface from the inferior surface. So you have learned something about it. So this is the same vermis. So you get the vermis here. This is the vermis on the inferior aspect, how you see it. On the inferior aspect. That is one thing. Then you get a separate lobe in this area. Now this was the folded brain. In this area, you get another lobe. This is the third lobe. Okay. This is called flocculonodular lobe. If you go to the text, so this is the flocculonodular lobe. And this uvulonodular fissure, what they are referring to, you don't have to remember all this, is the fissure between this posterior lobe and the flocculonodular lobe. That area there is a fissure that is called uvulonodular fissure. So this flocculonodular lobe, you have a nodule and floccule, there are different terms. You don't have to remember all this stuff. Okay. Just remember there is an anterior lobe, there is a middle or posterior lobe going right down into the inferior surface, middle or posterior. Then you have this flocculonodular lobe in that area. Okay, so the vermis is the part that connects the two sides of the cerebellum. Okay, so this is all a structural classification of the parts of the brain. Functional classification is totally different. They don't go into any of these details. Okay. Not that you don't have to remember, not that you have to remember all these details. I'm just telling you because certain parts are necessary in certain areas. Now you can identify a tonsil here. Here, this is called tonsil, cerebellar tonsil. Now, this is a clinically important area later on. When there is bleeding or when there's a tumor in the cranial cavity, when the pressure increases, the things in the cranial cavity, since it's a closed space, pressure increases inside the cranial cavity, and parts of the brain are pushed from one side to the other side or pushed down to the openings. Now, there are only few openings you get. You get an opening. Now, this is the falx cerebri. So, underneath that, things can move from side to side. Then you get the tentorium cerebelli, opening of the tentorium cerebelli, you remember? Through that, things can herniate. Then you get the foramen magnum lower down. Through that also things can herniate. So the cerebellar tonsils are just above the foramen magnum in the posterior cranial fossa. So when the pressure inside the cranial cavity increases too much, cerebellar tonsils can herniate through the opening of the foramen magnum down. And then that can compress the spinal cord inside the foramen magnum. Now, if somebody else creeps into this one, this will get compressed. That can actually compress the spinal cord and the person can die. The medulla also can get compressed because it's very close. So your respiratory centers, cardiac centers also can get affected because of this is called cerebellar tonsillar herniation. Tonsillar herniation. For that matter, you need to remember the cerebellar tonsils. You know, they are waiting to enter the foramen magnum. Like when you look at the specimens, you will understand it. They are just above the foramen magnum, waiting to enter it in case the pressure increases. Okay, so it's like this. So if the cerebellum is like this, tonsil is like this. Foramen magnum is here. Okay, they are about to enter like. Okay. Okay, now when it comes to the functional classification, this is a very simplified diagram of the cerebellum. Now this is like, now I told you about this folded paper. Now here what they have done is they have unfolded it so that you get the paper like this again. So you now nicely have the anterior and posterior ends of this paper in one plane, not in two planes. Okay. So you have the anterior lobe here, you have the posterior or the middle lobe here, then you have the flocculonodular lobe here. So this uvulonodular fissure, they call it posterior fissure here. And this is the horizontal fissure, which actually, there is the line that where the paper bent. The horizontal fissure is there. Okay, now it's in one plane. Now then you get the middle or the posterior lobe continuing between the primary fissure and the horizontal fissure as well. And at the primary fissure, you get the frontal lobe starting, anterior lobe starting. So this middle part is called the vermis. And the sides are the two cerebellar hemispheres. This is very clear. Okay. Now, when it comes to function, functionally, functionally, people talk about diseases of the lateral lobes. Lateral lobes are these cerebral hemispheres. Lateral lobes, when there is disease of the lateral lobes, lateral lobes, you get diseases. Then diseases of the center, vermis. Now, when it comes to the function of the cerebellum, now the cerebellum is a coordinating center, and when it coordinates, it represents ipsilaterally. Now, the cerebrum, the cerebral hemisphere, has a contralateral representation. Right side represents the left side and vice versa of the body. Cerebellum, on the other hand, has an ipsilateral representation. Left cerebellar hemisphere represents the left side of the body, right front, right side of the body. That's one thing. Then the other thing is, whatever the cerebral cortex, the motor cortex, when it sends information to muscles, motor impulses to muscles, at the same time, it sends the same impulses to the cerebellum. So that the cerebellum knows what is to be done. Because the brain, the cerebrum, wants to do something using the muscle. That information comes to the cerebellum as well. Then the other thing is, there are sensory receptors in the muscles. Whatever the level the muscle is contracted, the information is sent to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum knows what is to be done and what is being done, to which level the muscle has contracted. Now, based on this information, cerebellum can send information in that way and this way and coordinate. It's like a central place where coordinates the motor activities and sensory activities. Okay, so this is a very rough, simple way of explaining the role of cerebellum. So it gets information from both sides and coordinates the actions. Now there are, when the cerebellar coordination is lost, then you get what is called cerebellar ataxia. Now ataxia is, any uncoordinated movement of the body can be called ataxia. There are different types of ataxias. You get sensory ataxias, you get cerebellar ataxias, like in this case, and so on. There are other ataxias due to problems in the eye and other things. Now limb ataxia, when it comes to cerebellar ataxias, when there are diseases of the lateral cerebellar lobes, the two sides, you get limb ataxias. And because of the limb ataxia, you get a broad-based gait. Now, when you walk, your feet would be like this. In a broad-based gait, your feet would be like this. So the base is broad. And if it is a right cerebellar hemisphere problem, you tend to shift towards the right side in your walking. You can't, if you draw a straight line and ask the person to walk along that straight line, person will have a broad-based gait as well as he will move towards the right side. Cannot go through this line. Okay. Drunken people also will have the same problem because their cerebellar coordination may be out. So remember this. This is the lateral lobe problems. You get this limb ataxia and this veered towards the side of the lesion and all. When there is the lesion in the central cerebellum, that is the vermis area, you get truncal ataxia. So when a person is asked to stand straight or sit straight in a chair, tend to fall backwards or sideways because the truncal muscles in the trunk cannot coordinate. Okay, but in these people you don't have limb ataxia.